Welcome everyone to this, which is the next to the last session of the Spring 2025 workshop in the history of material texts. I'm Jerry Singerman, Senior Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and the co-convener of the workshop, along with Zach Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollock, where there he is, Curator for Research Services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. We're aided in everything we do by Peter Diamond, who is one of the truly great Bristol Schoenberg Fellows in the history of material texts, today in his penultimate public appearance in that capacity. Now, university press acquisitions editors, such as I was for many years, develop various kinds of muscle memory or perhaps better reflex reactions fairly quickly, primarily as a line of defense against a sea of unwanted manuscript proposals. Now, these reactions allow the editors to say that they don't publish dissertations. Another reaction is that they don't publish conference volumes. Now, the second kind of proposal is almost as common as the first. After all, who among you has not organized or participated in a symposium or even a single conference session and not come away with the sense that the papers all hung together so well or raised such important and overlapping questions that it would be a shame not to give them further life by shaping them into a book? Now, both these responses, automatic though they may be, are also more than somewhat disingenuous. Of course, we all published revised dissertations and still do. Without them, there would be very few first books. I always felt a bit less mendacious with the "we don't publish conference volumes" line, for such books were often easier to turn down, lacking intellectual and qualitative cohesiveness. There are many moving parts, generally presenting a likely headache for the publisher and an unforeseen set of challenges to volume editors who may have anticipated an easy book publication, only to face the near impossible challenge of herding the proverbial cats. But again, of course, there have been some truly extraordinary, ambitious, field-defining collections, books that any savvy acquisitions editor would be fortunate to have on their list. Which is all a preamble to my saying that I'm very happy indeed that the better angel who supervises smart and ambitious publishing was sitting on my shoulder and overriding the knee-jerk reactions when Rhae Lynn Barnes and Glenda Goodman first approached me with a proposal for a book that was supposed to emerge from an April 2020, remember what was happening in April 2020, conference, American Contacts Symposium, that was supposed to take place in person at Penn and Princeton. Needless to say, the conference did take place. It took place virtually. It was probably one of the first major endeavors to take place virtually. So it was really very nimble shape-shifting on everybody's part. And think of how adept or inadept you all were back in April 2020 with Zoom. Now, to be sure, American Contact, Objects of Intercultural Encounters and the Boundaries of Book History, as the eventual book publication is titled, is an edited collection whose complexities are such as to leave those presented by the run-of-the-mill edited volume behind in the dust. This is an edited collection on steroids. It's a book of nearly 50 short essays by as many contributors working in a dazzling array of European, American, African, Asian languages, each one writing on a textual, though not necessarily a lettered object, indigenous, colonial, post-colonial, religious, commercial, from the 8th century, a Mayan stela, to the 21st, a 2009 American Girl booklet. In addition, it has a detailed and elaborate website keyed to the book, but curated at another university, that's Princeton, with many more illustrations and much supplementary content. American Contact is altogether a project that forces us to re-examine our definitions of text more generally, and of hemispheric American texts in particular, and to think about the myriad ways in which these texts negotiate or are manifested by intercultural encounters. It is, in sum, an edited collection, magnified in both size and scope, and quite a splendid achievement all around, and one that Glenda and Rhae pulled off spectacularly. Now, more personally, although I did not see American Contact through production, it was among the last books that I acquired before my retirement from the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2021. And with its appearance this past fall, it likely becomes the final book to be published in the press's material text series, the enterprise to which I owe my own involvement with this seminar. It's especially meaningful to me then to be able to chair this session and to introduce Glenda, and at last count, 6 of the volume contributors, 3 in the room, 3 presenting online, all to think about Native American book history and textuality, one of the important threads that runs through the American Contact volume, and also one that we've been following from time to time in the workshop this semester, which will conclude next week with Roger Chartier's presentation on the European imagination and the Andean reality of the Quipu. Our format today is unusual one. Glenda will make some introductory comments. We will then hear from 6 of the contributors to the volume. I think we'll leave some time for a bit of conversation amongst themselves with our listening in, and then we'll open the discussion to the room. So Rhae Barnes is Assistant Professor of American Cultural History at Princeton University and former Sheila Biddle Ford Foundation Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. A public-facing intellectual, her website, U.S. History Scene, provides open access teaching resources to thousands of public schools and media outlets. And she's served as a senior consultant on the 4-part PBS documentary series, Reconstruction. She's currently completing a book on the political, economic, and cultural geography of amateur blackface minstrel shows from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Glenda Goodman is an associate professor of music here at Penn, specializing in American music of the 17th and 18th centuries. She's author of Cultivated by Hand, Amateur Musicians of the Early American Republic, published by Oxford in 2020, and winner of the Lewis Lockwood Award from the American Musicological Association. She's currently working on a book on American Protestant sacred music in the 18th century, and she and Rhae Lynn are in the early stages of a new project on printed music notation and imperialism in the long 18th century. Our speakers, in order in which they are presenting, I have to poke around because I had them in alphabetical order. Okay, will be first Jermaine Workington, who is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Toronto and a frequent participant via Zoom in this workshop. She's a scholar of Renaissance literature, Canadian exploration texts, modern Canadian literature, and book history, and she was named to the Order of Canada in July 2022. Marlena Petra Cravens is adjunct professor in the Department of Global Studies and Modern Languages at Drexel, with a focus on the history of language and conquest in the Americas from the late 15th through the mid-17th century. Our own John Pollock supplements the 120% that he gives to his work as curator of research services at KISLAC with his scholarship and teaching on the intersections of early American literature, Native American languages, and colonial writings from New France. He is co-curator with Jim Duffin of the exhibit Revolution at Penn, and if you haven't seen it already, you're missing something great. Daniel Radis is Associate Professor of English at SUNY Cortland. He specializes in the 18th and 19th century Indigenous literatures of North America, with particular interests in historical writing, book history, and print culture. Amy, and I hope I get this pronunciation right, but probably won't, Amy Ku'ulealoha Stillman is Arthur F. Turnow Professor and Director of the Native American Studies Program at the University of Michigan. A historical musicologist by training, her research focuses on Indigenous performance in Polynesia, especially Hawaii and Tahiti. Finally, Rachel Linnea Brown is an instructor of English at Haskell Indian Nations University, whose work focuses on 19th century Native American literatures, including the Southern Cheyenne autobiographer and historian George Brent. And with that, let me get out of the way and turn the floor over to Glenda and their panelists for the roundtable discussion of Inscribing Indigeneity in the Americas, a Hemispheric Approach to the History of the Book.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to first give some preliminary remarks and then just turn it over to our wonderful panelists. And I want to start by emphasizing how small each chapter in this volume is. We were very strict about the 3,000 word limit because that is kind of the perfect length for a teachable essay, in my opinion. And also because Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, in her 2010 presidential address to the American Historical Association, said that, quote, sometimes the best way to approach a big topic is to focus on a small one, like a quilt, which is what she often read. And that is actually how Rhae, Lynn, and I decided to open this book. We opened this book with a close reading of Queen Liliuokalani's quilt, which is housed at Iolani Palace in Honolulu. And they were courteous enough to let us use this high-res image and a bigger, well, not literally bigger than what you're seeing right now, but a higher res than is in the book image that's on the website, which I encourage everybody to look at. Rhae Lynn really wanted to start with this quilt because it brings together so many different elements trying to explore in this volume. And the point of this volume was to bring some of the questions that were coming from globalizing book history more fully to bear in the study of the Americas, and including the United States and other American entities' imperial reaches up to the present, which brought us to Hawaii. This quilt, for those of you who don't know it, is truly remarkable. The Queen made it while imprisoned in her palace after a takeover, partly engineered by the United States. And she made it with two other women, and each of the panels communicates something. Sometimes literally in writing, where she describes the coup that overthrew her, and sometimes in symbols, such as where she includes hibiscus flower, or the turtle, or a man with his hat blowing away, signifying maybe Westerners' inability to cope with Hawaiian weather. And the very medium of the quilt, it's a crazy quilt, itself, that she and her women, the women she made it with, chose to do this, tells us volumes, because this was a kind of handwork that was introduced to Hawaii by women who came with Anglo missionaries. And in some ways, this practice that was foisted, and in Hawaii, they didn't need these kinds of quilts. And so this practice that was more or less foisted upon them as a form of gendered handwork, in some ways, the Queen and the women who made it with her were saying, look, we can do this. We can do this just as well as you can, and we will use it to communicate and to make a record of this non-peaceful transfer of power that's being foisted upon us. So we thought this was an incredible example of how, when you go looking for modes of inscription that are polycultural, speak at multiple levels to different audiences based on how well the audiences or the readers could recognize what was being said, was a wonderful way to start our volume. So, oops, and that, so that was really what we set out to do, is to ask ourselves, how would someone read this quilt? And then to ask our authors to tell us, how do you read these objects or textual objects that came about or reveal something about intercultural encounters anywhere in the Americas? And the items our authors chose are really diverse. They range from 4 miles long to 7 by 10 centimeters. They date from millennia in the past to the 2000s, and they really wholly expand the periodization traditionally associated with the arrival of books as an event that can be dated, and arguably what even is a book in the context of this project, which we will come to. And I'll just finish here by glossing some of the key takeaways, and then talk a little bit more about its framing as in terms of Indigenous book history here today. But one of the big things we realized when we started getting proposals from people was that there was a real hunger from people who worked on any kind of textual objects to be in conversation with book history, even if they weren't doing research that was in departments that were traditionally engaged with book history or on bookish items. They came to us saying, please, we want to be engaged in this right now. So that tells us that this is a vibrant and growing field that has a lot of people who want to think about issues such as literacy and textual communication, oral traditions and visual representations and the history of knowledge. They want to do this in the context of the history of the book. One of the things we also came away from the project with was a real appreciation for what we ended up calling layered legibilities, which is the idea that textual objects from intercultural encounters possess multiple layers of meanings, reflecting power struggles and resistance and the blending of cultural traditions that could not be that were not uniformly self-evident or transparently didn't signify transparently and clearly to everyone who encountered them. We also talked a lot about orality and aurality, and many of the materials on the table, which I'm happy to talk about should there be time, actually have to do with how textual inscription attempts to, in some way, document a sonic presence and a verbal and oral expression. And we talked a lot about interdisciplinarity and methods, or how to translate a very disciplinary methodological approach to people outside of your discipline. We asked everyone to write as if they were writing for an audience of intelligent Martians. And that meant, that's supposed to be a little bit more funny, but that's okay. That meant really trying to walk people through your methodological process. And we'll have some examples of that today. So that brings me to the more specific things I wanted to say about the topic of inscribing indigeneity, which is, I just jumped ahead. Yes. Which our presenters here will be talking about the different kinds of problems and challenges and opportunities that come up when we talk about Indigenous book history. So as I just said, everyone found they needed to explicate their methods, and many participants in this project needed to combine methods to analyze and interpret their materials, which really got us thinking about where does that requirement rest? Where does disciplinary training and deep understanding of the tools of analysis rest in the realities of modern academia's current way of doing disciplines? I have to admit, I approach this a little bit as someone who is running a graduate program right now. So really trying to train the future generation. That really has made us think about both how the grimy reality of training syncs up with the creative and far-reaching visions for humanistic work that we see among our mentors and peers and junior scholars, but also how this fits with larger pressing problems about how we support work, any kind of work, in the face of resource crises and amid unequally shared pressures. So that was something we thought about in the context of doing this volume in truly terrible times in the COVID pandemic, people who had to drop out of the volume for that reason, but also obviously it is unfortunately continually relevant about these pressures people face. But then on a more scholarly, enjoyable scholarly side, we thought a lot about the limits of book history, and I think talking about today, and when and how is book really a useful organizing category. And then finally, we're going to be thinking about how we can bridge, how we as scholars attempt to bridge to people in the past, even if it's a very recent past, so people other than us. So identifying intention and voice, or hand and touch, as it were, or voices and hands and touches. All of these things become relevant as we try to figure out what is an ethical and meaningful way to interpret these materials. And I'm going to use as my segue a quote from Germaine Warkentin's chapter, in which she asks, how do we understand the terms that Plains Indigenous inscription sets for its own understanding? And I think that is really what we are humbly all about here in this workshop, and especially here today for this seminar session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Germaine, our first speaker.
I'd like to begin by thanking you and Lynn for producing such a massive and important book. It's going to be it was a very deep dive when it came, and I was delighted to be involved in it. We owe you a vote of thanks, and we owe you also for the occasion that we are at. I'm very pleased about that because it's very nice to see the faces of the people whom I have been communicating with over about, well, when did COVID start? Because I think it started up just before COVID. Anyway, I thank you very much for the book, and I thank you very much for the occasion. It's hard to say without becoming overly technical where American Contact fits into the broader field of book history, a subject of great interest to me, because book history is a field of study still making itself in terms of subject matter, format, and cultural focus. Under that name, it is less than a century old, originating in France in the 1930s. If you question book historians, you'll find that they give you very different answers as to what book history is. And in that respect, American Contact is typical. I recently had that, well, not so recently, but a year ago, had that experience when I reviewed, I forget what, the Brill's Companion to Classics in the Early Americas, not a book I have seen mentioned in any of the things I've been reading lately, but it has a great deal to say about a great deal that is untheorized to say about the sort of thing that we are interested in. And because I'm so interested in early things, as you will see, I thought that it was important to mention it. Raylin's questions, which she sent us, suggest that we should say something about our background and so on. So historically, my approach has usually been called bibliography, not counting and listing books as most people think, but a deep and almost visceral appreciation of what makes the book in your hand book in your hand, folded paper, sewing, binding, the practices of scribe or printing house, the discriminations behind the catalogs of the book collector, the making of great libraries, and the human activities and responses that emerge from that kind of study. But American Contact marks the first major attempt to explore the ways in which non-European societies have inscribed meaning. What it shows is that we have to relearn the history of the book in a radically different way. We have to learn to read all over again. Though I taught Renaissance and Canadian writing, they were not my quote unquote fields. Really, it was the physical entity, at least not in my head. Those were practical things I did to make sure that I kept track of what was in my head. Really, it was the physical entity of all the books I taught that challenged me intellectually. The provocation to work on Indigenous materials came from Canadian literature, where I made myself a specialist in the earliest writings, explorers' journals, not much valued by my colleagues, but threaded through these very European descriptions and memoirs was the presence of otherness represented by the native peoples. I cannot forget the first moment when I saw the image of a cut in a tree and realized that for the people I was seeking to understand, the cut belonged to a language eloquent with cultural information that had to be interpreted. Go here, don't go here. It was a long time ago and the cut is fading. No, it was yesterday. They knew and I didn't. But I had friends who helped, Frank Solomon and Heidi Bohacker and others. The shaping experience took place when on a long car trip, where's Writing on Stone? Got it. On a long car trip with my geographer husband, I came to Writing on Stone in southern Alberta. I knew a little about this great cliff, but seeing it, the effect on my thinking was immense. If the cut on the tree engendered questions, the cliff was full of answers. The problem was that in those days, I couldn't get to my subject. Consider that a research situation in which you have an immense number of questions about what you want to do, and you can't get at what, you can't touch the stuff, you can't get at it. It's too big to get up. This makes it look slightly dollhouse looking. The picture was taken by my husband from a great distance. We were way, way back here. And it looks like it looks sort of dollhouse-ish, but it isn't like that. It absolutely towers over you. And it's very long, nearly 4 miles, or maybe a little more long. And it's just itself. It's not anything else. It's just itself. And it is, and you have to remember that North America is a heavily overwritten object, if we can consider it in that way. There's an enormous amount of writing of this sort that of which this is symbolic and also probably the most formidable example. Anyway, I couldn't get up on it. The problem was in those days, I couldn't get to my subject. No one was allowed unless on scientific work, and I was a tourist with a free afternoon, not a scholar with a grant and a rented plane. Situation is much different now. Writing on stone has been named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and I believe you can take a tour. The challenge of the Great Cliff to me was to demonstrate that what everyone called rock art, keep that description in time, in mind, that what everyone called it rock art was actually inscription, letters, signs, which conveyed verbal meanings, and when assembled together could convey larger verbal meanings, not pretty pictures, which unfortunately, if you dig into the literature, it's a phenomenon that you find over and over and over again. Drives me nuts. Okay. The challenge of the Great Cliff was to demonstrate that what everyone called rock art was actually inscription. I was aided in my research by the few very fine books by the few earlier scholars who were able to make the climb and recorded what they could. People like James Kaiser, who began to devise a lexicon of Plains Indian verbal signs. Right here, they published the first part of it in 1981, a lexicon for historic Plains Indian rock art, increasing interpretive potential. And he explains things that pass by our eyes when we actually look at these materials. He says how they are signs for particular situations, for particular words, and the best, of course, being, I suppose, most illustrative, being the sign for having her hair and scalping, which is a picture of a head with the hair trailing behind. Marvelous. Okay. I was aided in my research by fine books by the few earlier scholars who were able to make the climb and recorded what they could. People like James Kaiser, who began to devise a lexicon of Plains Indian verbal signs. The Kaiser study was vital there, and in work not yet published, I hope to carry it further. That record of is of signal importance because writing on stone is made of sandstone. And one day it will be gone unless scientists can figure out a way to stop the erosion. You think of your books in a rare book library being carefully secluded and don't touch them and that sort of thing. Well, that's going to go if sometime in the future, if we don't do for it what it needs to do this. A man called Brink is working on this. I met him at my Order of Canada thing. The Kaiser study was vital there, and I hope to carry it further. That record is of signal importance because writing on stone is made of sandstone, and one day it will be gone unless scientists can figure out a way to stop the erosion. Digitization, I'm picking this up from the list that we were given. Digitization poses questions that trouble me deeply as a material culture person. Because while digitization can describe the material artifacts, for those artifacts, it can never replace the testimony of the human eye and hand. Digitization is a very sophisticated convenience, but the experience of handling the real thing is irreplaceable. I longed to touch the inscriptions at writing on stone. It won't surprise you when I say that the book I'm currently working on, A Critical History of the Codex, is called The Book in Your Hands. Thank you.
All right, before jumping in, I'd like to thank Drs. Rhae and Glenda Goodman for putting all of this together and the workshop in the History of Material Text seminar for hosting us. I also want to take a second to acknowledge all the folks who made this research possible, including Dr. Ana Lu Lopez at the Newberry Library for her early guidance with Nahuatl, and the University of Oregon's Nahuatl Dictionary, and everyone at the Preservation Research and Testing Division at the Library of Congress who made the book history parts of this a success. They opened my eyes to how books can be studied as physical objects, not just as text. I'm going to jump in with some information about my object and to give a little context for it, and then I'll talk about where my research took me and some basic conclusions. A lot of my research ended up deriving from conservation techniques that are used to preserve books, so I'll sort of lean on that a little bit if I can. All right, so I studied Alonso de Molina's Arte de la Lengua Mexicana y Castellana, which was printed in 1571, exactly 50 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. Molina was a Franciscan priest who arrived in Mexico in 1522 as a child and grew up speaking Nahuatl and Spanish before joining the priesthood. His grammar book is for Nahuatl. It was a mere 14 centimeters in length, less than the length of the average person's hand. Since his grammar was small, Molina was limited in the basic grammatical information and in the vocabulary that he could include forced translated examples, a few of which I'll talk about in a second. These are two other grammars, speaking of hands and books. Using my own hand to measure the length of them, you can see grammar books are typically quite small. Both of these are shorter than my hand. The one on the left is for Tupi-Guarani from Brazil, and the one on the right is for Quechua. You can see it's actually quite a bit shorter than my hand. Molina's book is the same. It's very short, or very small, I should say. My hand is just not smashed on top of the book. Just to be clear, there's a snake holding the page down. My hand's hovering right above it. I swear I'm not touching the ink. Yeah, I promise. These were not his only limitations. Molina was writing about classical Nahuatl, but was trying to use the grammatical terms that he knew from European grammar books. These two difficulties are important to consider because his book was the first printed grammar for facilitating Nahuatl-Spanish communication and was a reference for beginner Nahuatl learners in the 1500s. These people were primarily other preachers, perhaps government officials, and merchants. In short, it was for a European audience. With that in mind, his grammar could impact the terms of Spanish Nahuatl communication through the types of vocabulary that it provided to learners. Nahuatl speakers who learned from this book would find clear limits for what they could talk about, with most incorporated vocabulary revolving around sin, conversion, and religion in general, anthropological considerations for understanding family units, and, interestingly, items popular in the tribute system. I will focus on three examples here. First, being good and our Father on this slide. I've just sort of underlined these from the grammar. But you can see the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red lines are talking about goodness. We have vosotros sois buenos, y'all are good. Aquellos son buenos, they are good. Los señores son buenos, right? The men or the lords are good. Yo era bueno, I was good, I will be good, yo seré bueno. And down below, we have some vocabulary related to possessive adjectives. My father, mi padre, your father, tu padre, and our father, nuestro padre, right at the bottom. So there's like a very specific type of language being included in this grammar book. In my second example here, which is from a section focused on possessive adjectives as well, his terms focus or feature dirtiness, mi suciedad, y cosa sucia, and has it set alongside the noun for blackness, mi negrura, which could be a spiritual blackness, but can also connect to skin color. Finally, in his section on the use of comparatives in Nahuatl, and I don't have a slide for this one, we see examples like Dios ama más a Juan que a Pedro, God loves John more than Peter, and el oro es mucho más precioso que la plata, gold is much more precious than silver. These types of phrases point to European interest regarding not just Christianity and proselytizing, but also the value of the transatlantic value of commercial goods like gold and silver. This is what priests were learning to talk about, like priests. Something striking about these examples is that the use of Peter and John in grammar books is not unique to Molina's grammar book, nor is connecting skin color to sinfulness. Extending this outward, in Domingo de Santo Tomas's grammar book for Quechua, which I showed earlier, readers encountered the same phrase, God loves John more than Peter, but added the comparative phrase in the very next line is, John is whiter than Peter, Juan es más blanco que Pedro, which very explicitly connects whiteness to being more loved by God. And so at the same time that grammar books like Molina's facilitated early communication in the Americas, they did so in a way that impacted how Indigenous languages were learned and used by missionaries. So beyond the contents of the book itself, what can we learn about actual individuals who may have used this book and may have learned from it? Combining the history of Molina's book with a textual analysis and a material analysis of the paper, writing styles, and inks left in the book, we can begin to learn more about past Nahuatl learners that specifically engaged with the Library of Congress's copy, which is where these pictures are from. Basically, I can confirm that this book was actually used by people. Confirming this is useful because we should keep in mind that just because a book was printed does not mean many people used it. Evidence of use and general wear and tear is actually a very important thing. Overall, my analysis was possible because this grammar book was well used and stained, with inky fingerprints in the bottom corners of some of the pages, and 10 whole added pages of notes at the end, where learners actually engaged with the book. But there are elements of a book that my eye can fail to see, and that my photos can fail to capture. Ink types and paper types are easy things to lose in the pictures I've shown. And you can kind of see that here a little bit. To accurately date the learner's notes, I've connected a paleographic analysis with scientific methods like spectroscopy. Specifically, I used Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to narrow down the age of the paper of the appended learner's notes to know something about when they were made or when they were at least written on this paper. And fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy to identify the ink types used on the appended pages. Both of these types of spectroscopy are important parts of book conservation and its research. Based on the data I collected, it is likely that the individual or individuals learning from the appended notes worked in the late 1500s or early 1600s and may have been affiliated with the church based on some common early modern abbreviations in Gothic script samples and translated prayers. You can note here, these are on the appended pages. The majority of it is in one type of hand. You have a second example here below with a more Gothic script. And then below that, very faintly, you can see someone copying Josephus, but it's a very unconfident hand. This is someone who maybe does not write a lot or was perhaps learning how to write. They also used two types of red ink. One type was made with vermilion and the other with cochineal. And you can see the red ink there. Cochineal is red ink from the Americas and was not known to Europeans until after 1492. In reverse, while natural vermilion was known to Mesoamericans, the mineral was rare. This data combined together shows that the individual, or perhaps individuals who wrote on the inserted pages, inhabited an intercultural space that had access to European inks like vermilion, as well as cochineal. They used this book not only to learn Nahuatl conjugation, but to translate biblical passages and prayers into Nahuatl, like the story of the Tower of Babel. And it's very likely that they were affiliated with the church based on the script types that we see. Further, we can see the formative process of a learner engaging Molina's text with all of its problematic representations of race and religion and using it to learn Nahuatl. And that's what I have. Yeah.
This has been said already, but I do think it's important to, copy of the book is going around, if you haven't seen it, to sort of describe the impressive achievement that this book represents. That is 48 contributors and essays. The work of putting together the event from which this started online in that pandemic year of 2020 and this volume in print, that's a lot of cats to herd. I can't even imagine just the emails. Yes, buried in a folder somewhere, I hope. That the book has both the range we've heard about, and yet I hope you'll agree when you see coherence. Such coherence is another feat. So I'm happy to have had a little part in it. And these are very teachable essays, I hope and think, and I'm kind of looking forward to trying that myself. My own contribution to the volume began for me as an investigation of a linguistic and typographic phenomenon that I first noticed decades ago and have puzzled over ever since. I'm showing you here the first page of a printed prayer, which is presented as the writing of a Wendat or Huron-Wendat person converted to Christianity by French Jesuit missionaries in the Great Lakes region in the early 1640s. I don't have a picture of the book, but the book is on the table, and to echo my colleague, it is not too much larger than my hand, a small format text, not a grand fancy book at all. My essay asks, how might we understand or learn to read this curious passage? It's 9 pages long, this prayer, and it concludes, so it's actually the end section, final section of one of the annual Jesuit relations. If you don't know what those are, Jesuit relations were printed letters, so-called, detailing the spiritual progress of missions led by Jesuits. These are accounts printed and produced in Paris, popular with Catholic readers, and circulated far and wide in Francophone spaces. In this kind of curious example, I hope you can see how odd it is. These are printed Wendat words above which, in a smaller typographic font, float almost an interlinear French translation. So I ask, whose words are these? How did this text move from speech to writing to print? Who transliterated and who translated these words? And how did readers, maybe multiple communities of different readers, read or see or hear this, I hope you agree, visually striking text? And how should we interpret its layout and typography? My essay attempts some possible answers and is very speculative. Some of the strangeness of the text is actually expressed in the orthography of its author's name. We'll come back to that word author, Joseph Chiwatenwa. I've excerpted that in a larger image above. Joseph, a Christian name adopted by Chiwatenwa at the time of his conversion. He maintains both names as one of a small group of converts baptized and renamed with an adopted Christian identity. You can, I think, see how even this transliterated, printed native name evokes an important part of the Jesuits' linguistic project. That is to say, writing Wendat words in their Latin alphabet. The alphabet was, however, insufficient. And if you see that strange character, that is a ligature of O and U, that's a character from a Greek typeface, also used by printers for a micron and upsilon, but it was adopted by the Jesuits in these printed relations and in their manuscripts to express a sound that could not be represented in French alphabetically, a combination that we might approximate as ou, or sometimes written as a W. So how do we even say Joseph's Wendat name, Shiwatenwa, perhaps? I think this transliteration here exposes the necessarily approximate nature of what we're looking at. Did some readers grasp the sound that the Jesuits were attempting to represent? For others, surely that name looked odd, distinctive, and alien, a kind of visually striking artifact on a page. And this long prayer, 9 pages, as I said, has to be understood, I think, in multiple and quite possibly contradictory ways. These are appropriated words, the pious expressions of a convert. This man, Joseph Shiwatenwa, had already been killed in an attack, somewhat mysterious attack, by the time his words appeared in print. So this is, at least at first, a document of Christian conversion, an échantillon, as the headnote describes it, or specimen, suggesting exhibited curiosity, display, fascination, and missionary success as well, implicitly. At the same time, I'd like to suggest that what we see here is more than a missionary tool, and that we might consider Joseph Shiwatenwa as a writer and a translator in his own right, even, I think, as an author. I'd like to suggest that we ought to think more about this term authorship in colonial contexts in early modernity. So my essay concludes with an attempt to understand this odd, complex prayer, even if we are, of course, at a very far remove from the Wendat world of the 17th century, and even if there are no living native speakers of this language. I have spoken, I should say, to a small number of Wendat specialists about this text, and I would like to extend those discussions in the future. Just to give a small example of this, how might we understand a striking, puzzling phrase that is at the beginning of the prayer? I won't try to speak the Wendat, but I can say the French, Maître du canot que nous avons fait canot. One modern linguist gives this translation: just as we are the masters of the canoes and the longhouses we have made, so you are our master because you made us. That may be a strong translation, but I also think that for me, it kind of elides or obscures the poetic strangeness of the printed French words on this page and the visual strangeness of how they appear. Perhaps I suggest we could hear these words as an expression of a connection of place, space, and movement on earth to the spiritual worlds of Joseph Shiwatenwa. He may be a writer, translator, narrator, and author who expresses faith not in the Jesuits' language, but on and in his own terms. There's a final irony here that some of you may have noticed. The word canoe is itself derived from canoa, a word from a very different place, the language of the Taínos, the peoples of the islands encountered by Columbus in 1492, and violently erased, enslaved, and subjugated by the Spanish within a short period. That word has migrated and moved into a strikingly different time period and context. So just a couple of more general remarks that we could hopefully follow up on. My essay is actually maybe one of the more traditional, in quotes, in this book, in that it attempts to interpret a more or less standard early modern European book, or a portion of it. But I am suggesting that this book, or a portion of it, can be thought of as an intercultural artifact. Other essays in this collection, like those we're hearing about, push the boundaries of the field much further, and these so-called object biographies bring us to something that might be a lot more familiar in a museum studies context, perhaps, than for those of us working in literature or history. Stone, as we've heard, music, the language of book bindings, and much more. That's a powerful and challenging methodology for us to consider. Our editors, Rhae, Lynn, and Glenda, call these essays investigations of intercultural legibility and illegibility. And I thought we might think a little bit more about the legible and the illegible in our work. So my not so great Latin and a tiny bit of dictionary work tells me that legere, of course, can mean to read, but also to select or pluck out. So what do we select when we choose our objects? How does this process of selecting, of plucking, impact what we read and how we interpret? And of course, as we know, our archives, our repositories, our disciplines are also places of radical selectivity. This book actually works very hard to draw together expertise across fields with very different trainings and practices. And I wonder how we can continue that work of drawing together. Many of the essays here also encounter profound uncertainty, which is to say the illegible. Words we tend to use in this field often, like hybrid or intercultural, that's a word I use and comes up a lot, actually might not fully get at the difficulties here. And I think all the authors in this volume confront the real limits of their and our comprehension. I know this feeling because every day I find books and documents every day that puzzle me. These collaborative studies don't ignore or erase illegibility, but try to acknowledge and work with it. We'll certainly return to some of these questions next week when Roger Chartier will speak about ink and quipus, but as understood by 18th century French writers and readers. The word legere also has a connotation of working in a diplomatic sense across spaces and cultures, as in the phrase being a legate, an envoy. Interdisciplinarity has long been a call among book historians, and this volume suggests the ongoing challenge of that interdisciplinary, and I should certainly add interlinguistic work. Perhaps this project can serve in an ongoing way as a kind of bridge and a model for future exchanges. Thanks.
Thanks, Glenda, and of course, Rhae, for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be in conversation with all of you in the book and in the room. So I'm just going to give a bit of a distillation of the chapter that I wrote. This is a collection of Episcopal hymns printed in a dialect of Dakota and published in 1885. The book features a chemise binding, which is something essentially a slipcover of animal hide and fabric that has been embroidered with dyed porcupine quills. On the front cover, a pleated border frames a cross in blue, red, and yellow. On the back, a purple border surrounds a shape that references that cross, but also transcends it. Inside the book is an inscription. These are all the images up above, establishing that Bishop Hare presented the book in late 1898 to S.C. Edsel. Hare was in his third decade as the head of the missionary district in South Dakota. Edsel was a rector in Chicago who had been elected that year to lead a district north of Hare's. In all likelihood, then, the hymnal was given to Edsel to recognize this new role. It marked the start of a bond between the men, forged in a shared mission that lasted until Hare's funeral, over which Edsel presided. This story, of course, is partial. It trades in the lives of Indigenous people, but it does so really to illuminate the lives of settler men. In its focus on the inscription, the story privileges one exchange from Hare to Edsel, and I would suggest it neglects another from the book's artist to Hare himself. This emphasis obscures the artist, a Dakota woman, and her reasons for offering the book to the bishop. From this partial vantage, the hymnal offers a likewise partial sense of how the Episcopal faith spread across the plains. It asks us to think of missionization as a simple process, wherein the conversion of Indigenous peoples consisted of their uncritical acceptance of static images like the cross, passed here in this book quite literally from one generation of missionaries to the next. Here, the lives of Indigenous people become little more than the decorative embellishments on settler narratives, the quilled crosses on the books exchanged to mark settler achievements. This partial account then hides from readers the artist's effort to engage with her faith in adaptive and creative terms. But as we know from Glenda and Raylan's wonderful collection, there are, of course, other stories here to be read. To learn them, though, requires a different approach, one that considers otherwise obscured facets of the book's production, reception, and purpose. So if the orthodox story of this hymnal focuses on settler men, on written words, and on static images, then a different approach might focus on how Indigenous women used other inscriptive practices to alter the design, meaning, and use of those images. The quills affixed to objects like this book, after all, speak to the integral role of women in Dakota life. The initial exchange of this hymnal from the artist to Hare placed the latter in a network of social and sacred relations. These relations influenced both missionization and conversion, turning an assimilative process into something more complex, more dialogic, in its integration of Dakota and Episcopal traditions. That complex process seems best represented not in the hymnal's cross, but in the movement between the front and back covers. In other words, the quills on this hymnal preserve the cross, but I want to suggest transform it as well. These covers, if they're read like the inscription between two settler men that they conceal, offer lessons of Indigenous persistence, adaptation, and renewal. In this period, books like this one were rather common. Hide was sewn onto 2 scraps of fabric, forming sleeves into which the original boards were placed. In this case, the original boards likely featured a conventional cross framed with a simple border. The slipcover then obscures that original cross, only for that cross to reappear in an altered form that, I argue, reveals the complexities of conversion. On the front cover, the cross is emphasized through appeals to Dakota traditions. For the Dakota, red can evoke a series of sacred associations, including the admonition to walk the red road, that is, to live in a manner consistent with traditional values. The color also reflects the role of women in Dakota life, as does that lozenge, which is often associated with women, birth, and the ceremonial practices that protected children's health. This cross then serves not only as an Episcopal symbol, but importantly as a Dakota one, and more as one that foregrounds the roles of Dakota women. It's an active image of intercultural encounter, not a static emblem of imposed beliefs. On the back cover, the image is more ambiguous. Given that this book's purpose is to prompt a transformation, however, we can consider how this image transforms the one on the front. In the red petals and yellow stem of this flower, for example, is a faint but visible trace of the cross that has been otherwise obscured. The lozenge at the base of that cross seems to proliferate on the back, its form perhaps unfurling into the roots of the flower. Even the new color takes root, so to speak, on the front, with the woven red and blue of that front image combining to form purple, which is of course a liturgical color in the Episcopal tradition. The design here thus seems not a new image, but a transformation of its obverse, a synthesis of 2 traditions that on the front are integrated but extricable. The artist's beliefs, this book suggests, were a blend of Dakota and Episcopal traditions, a fusion of established roots and new blooms. And just to wrap up here, the stories this book can tell then don't end with its written content, neither with the inscription or the hymns printed inside. These words provide one narrative, an important one, but a partial account that relies for its authority on elements of the book that some readers might perceive as more legible or familiar than quills, hides, and the designs that connect them. If, as book historical scholarship asks of us, we must look both at the immaterial content and the material presence of books like this one, we have to recognize too that different aspects of the latter, the material presence, tell different stories. They teach different lessons, and thus they require of us very different methods. Thanks.
Okay. I begin as with everyone else by thanking Glenda and Lynn for this amazing opportunity, and even more so for the amazing product that resulted. I recall at the initial call for papers that I wrote in and asked if Hawaii was included in America, because there are many instances in which America is continentally hemispheric, and the islands are usually not in view, beyond view. But with the invitation to contribute, that America was indeed part of this American configuration. I'm also grateful to eBay for the occasion on which this sheet music became available at a time when all of my music collecting competitors were apparently on vacation. It was karma and meant to be. Um, I'd already been studying this for a long time, but the opportunity to actually own this material artifact was very incredible. Okay, so my chapter focuses on this printed music folio. It was published in 1892, and it contains 2 songs in it. Both songs are marked. You can see hula kui under the titles of both songs. And a newspaper announcement of this sheet music in June of 1892 announced that, quote, the music and words of 2 hula kuis this is the first ever printed. So I use this historically significant printed sheet music to articulate, and I chose the word articulate rather than identify or locate, because I didn't want the language of finding, but the language of expressing. So I use this sheet music to articulate Indigenous Hawaiian agency and logics that flow beneath the intercultural encounters and social transformations in Hawaii over the late 19th century. I used 2 toolkits in particular in my chapter. One is called, I named it Print Culture, and the other I named it the Tune Itinerary. For print culture, I looked at the milieu of textual and musical literacies and how they came about, and it did a kind of a Foucauldian analysis in order to explore the conditions of possibility for the material representation of Hawaiian songs in print. The introduction of multiple literacies in this case owes entirely to missionary efforts of the American missionaries who came in 1820. First of all, missionaries rendered Hawaiian language into the Roman alphabet. Secondly, they taught the alphabetic literacy so that Hawaiians would be able to read the Bible. Third, the missionaries taught rudiments of choral singing as part of the worship process. And fourth, these particular American missionaries taught and promoted the use of Western staff notation and proceeded to produce published tune books over about a 7-decade period that circulated in the tens of thousands in terms of quantity. My second tool, the Tune Itinerary, is a bibliographic mapping of a tune across space and time, and included mapping journeys of these tunes across text, print, sonic, and visual media. Sound recordings were a very important part of the mixture in with print culture. Sound recordings allowed me gramophone culture allowed me a framework that I could place sound recordings in relationship to both print culture and Hawaiian performance practices. So the gramophone culture, the history of tracking these tunes through sound recordings, confirms a thriving oral performance practice of what I call systematic tune variation over time. In other words, tunes are malleable and adaptable, and singers are encouraged to practice a particular kind of variation of a tune where you sing the tune straight the first time through, you play with the tune in subsequent repetitions, but in the final stanza, you return to the tune straight up. The Tune Itinerary, it's a bibliographic compilation, but then arranged chronologically. It facilitated tacking between printed representations and sounded performances of repertoire, and allowed me to note when departures from practice then became models for subsequent representation. The 2 songs in this particular folio have very contrastive patterns, journeys, if you will, across time. The first, Ipole Manu, appeared in 10 songbooks published between 1913 and 2002. And it appeared on approximately 6 recordings between 1904 up to 2015. The second song, Puomele Kule, appeared only in 3 notated sources that I've been able to identify so far, and appears on only 5 recordings, the first in 1928 and 4 subsequent recordings between 1975 and 2015. So my analysis focused on how these multiple literacies, alphabetic and musical staff notation literacies, combined with continuity of Hawaiian performance practices, and these two things, literacy and practice, formed the genealogical conditions of possibility for the production of 2 hula ku'i songs in sheet music. So that I came out with an understanding that this 1892 piece of sheet music for this particular type of song represents a convergence of print culture and indigenous Hawaiian practice. Okay. With respect to the language and methodology of decolonization, which is a tempting move to make in indigenous critical indigenous studies, I avoided that language entirely because I wanted to avoid thinking of decolonizing methods in this kind of context as simply dismantling hybrid products into their constituent indigenous and non-indigenous parts. Instead, my process involved looking carefully and closely beneath the materials and transactions of encounter that we see represented visually as musical notation and alphabetical literacy, to look between these in order to find the streams of indigenous agency. In other words, not looking for what the constituent parts are, but rather how they have come to be combined. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I also want to begin with gratitude, especially for Rhae, Lynn, and Glenda and all of the work. This project has gone on 5 or 6 years, which is fabulous and such an incredible opportunity. Thank you to fellow presenters, UPenn, and everyone in the audience today. So it's been such an incredible conversation. I've taken lots of notes. I'm speaking with you today from Haskell Indian Nations University. I didn't know this when I first started working with Chauncey Yellowrope, who is a Sicango Lakota film actor, activist, and teacher that I would one day be teaching at a tribal college. So my work and my thoughts about it has continued to evolve, especially working with students here. I am a non-native white woman, thinking about how, especially in the mid to late 1800s within the Midwest, Native writers especially were interested in intercultural contact, advocating for culture, popping up in unexpected places. So we could move to the next slide. I say unexpected just because I was approaching text when I was working on my dissertation with the sense of what I thought might I encounter and what I actually did. So I first met Chauncey Yellowrope when I was looking at a settler text for Rapid City as a publishing hub within South Dakota near the reservations in the area, certainly a lot of Native presence, but not necessarily in books that were published. So there was a text from 1918, Holiday Greetings from Rapid City. It's about a 100-page book of promotions for the area. And almost every single essay and photograph in that book celebrates white settler culture, except for an essay by Chauncey Yellowrope. The book was reissued in 1920 and updated with new essays. And again, they're celebrating the area. But the major difference was in 1920, there were no Native writers. And so that placed special importance on Chauncey Yellowrope's presence within the first volume. And I was definitely curious to hear more. So Chauncey Yellowrope's essay in the 1918 volume was a brief autobiography about growing up in South Dakota and being forced to go to Carlisle as a 12-year-old boy. And in following his life story, I came across the Carlisle Digital Record, which was fabulous, was curious about what information might be available about him in that student file. And so one of the documents that stood out when looking at his digital documents was a survey of graduates and returned students that was sent out to all former Carlisle students in 1910. And initially, I expected it to just be a kind of cut and dry institutional form. And as it turned out, Chauncey and others used this pre-filled form as a chance to assert individuality, celebrate education, and advocate for better treatment for other, especially Native children and students at the time. And they did in some really interesting ways. So Chauncey wrote the form in both pen and pencil, as you can see on this image. And what's interesting is that it kind of looks like the pen came first, starting to commit with ink the questions that he felt comfortable answering. So some of them are, what are your present occupation? And at that time, he was a teacher at Rapid City Indian School. Salary, he left that blank. As the questions go on, he started to feel that they became a little too personal. And so at another point with pencil, I prefer not to answer these questions as they seem rather personal. So there's 3 pages to this survey. The first 2 pages have more of those kind of cut and dry institutional questions. The last page of the survey, though, is open-ended. And the 12th question is along the lines of, is there anything else you want us to know? And Chauncey Yellow Robe and a lot of his fellow graduates and survivors used that space to assert their own stories, to take the readers back, even though he was now an adult working as a teacher of Native children, to the moment that he was 12 years old and stepping onto Carlisle's campus for the first time, including the trauma of his hair being cut, his clothes being removed and posed for a photographer. So this form, which itself does not seem to be a book, was incredibly transformative and important for Chauncey Yellow Robe. That last paragraph, this space where you wouldn't necessarily expect a really rich and important story, a form of resistance and celebration of presence to emerge, does. And Chauncey used the paragraph that he wrote at the end of the form to expand into that autobiographical essay that he republished 3 times. First was in 1918 in this kind of holiday edition for Rapid City. The second was in the Society of American Indians publication alongside a poem with Zakala Shaw. And the third and final time that this essay circulated was in a promotional magazine, essentially, for the silent film The Silent Enemy, which Chauncey Yellow Robe starred in just a year before he passed. So overall, looking at this form, starting with a book and tracing backward to that genesis of the first paragraph, really helps us think more deeply about what is a book, who are authors, where does that authorship start? How can we find these voices and celebrations and processing of trauma with an eye for how do we heal and move forward and take care of Native children now and in the future? How do we find those? Where can we look? And how can we approach these spaces with that curiosity and that sense of wonder? And so just following a rabbit hole thread based on one book led to this conversation that continues to unfold for me personally on this campus as well as professionally as more connections with Chauncey Yellow Robe and the Society for American Indians emerges. So I appreciate the chance for this evolution and this journey to take place and be documented in a book for now. And I appreciate everyone's chance to continue thinking about how our research is evolving and continuing to be in conversation to represent that true movement of book history as it grows and changes. So thank you.
Before we open to the floor, are there things you'd like to say to one another, based on what you've all been talking about, what you've been hearing, what binds your questions together, where you may feel you're working on radically different kinds of texts in pretty radically different ways? Are there more commonalities than differences, or more differences than commonalities in what you're looking at?
I can start just with I was struck by something to kind of bring us full circle from Jermaine speaking about a cliff and Rachel speaking about a form, and both of them saying more or less these are not quite books, but of course there's very little that connects the form with the cliff. So I guess my question for everybody, and this is a question I've thought quite a bit about, is like, what does it mean to, what is a book? I mean, what's the definition? What's our working definition of the book in the context of Indigenous inscription? Is it important to say that something is a book? If it's not important to say that something is a book, then what are the affordances and benefits maybe of the methodologies that come out of bibliographical practice that allow us to say something different or meaningful about these textual practices and materials? So if I just open that up to kind of everybody, I know Jermaine has thought quite a bit about this and written about it as well.
Thinking about the title of the workshop. It's a workshop in the history of material text, not history of the book.
Yeah.
No.
Maybe that's a way to think about that. That these are kinds of texts that have a materiality. It's not necessarily materiality of the book. I don't know. I'm just.
I mean, one thing we thought about a
I
lot.
could say a word
from-
about that, because in what I've been reading and trying to write for about the past 10 years is this book on the Codex. And I can say that book is one of the most elusive terms in the lexicon of any language. And I don't know, I don't have an answer to it. I just think you have to be very, very careful when you're talking and you're using the term book to make it clear just particularly where you're coming from and where you're going to. It is a word with many, many different uses. A Broadway producer talks about the book of the item that she's going to put on. She doesn't mean the same thing at all as what we mean. It's a fault of the language, really, and I don't have any real answers to it except to be extremely clear about what you mean. I feel the same way about what's in the book, writing. You have to be very clear that you mean not the poetic act of writing, which produces the poem, but inscription, a pen, a pencil, letters and figures. I don't think it's very wise to confine what we know about book history to those terms, but I think you have to know which terms you're going to use as you go forward. In any situation, you're going to have to know what those terms mean. I've read a lot of very silly stuff in researching this book that I'm trying to write. It makes me write too much stuff to explain myself. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
But you see, I think you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I
But in
hope.
fact, I mean, three of you were talking about codices. And one could say that two of those codices were conventionally or tilted toward the conventionally European codex form. One of the codices was truly a hybrid artifact in its materiality, right? That is, Dan's, you're looking at, let's say, a colonial, conventionally printed document whose nature is changed by Indigenous hands being applied to it, whereas John and Marlena's texts were European transcriptions of native language printed with European type or European imported type in a conventional codex form. Are those radically different kinds of features? I mean, to the kind of hybrid artifact, I would add the Queen's quilt. To the purely native artifact, if we can talk in those terms, is Germain's writing on stone. So the hybridization plays out in very different ways in all of these particular objects you've been looking at. And again, talking about a codex is not, I think, totally irrelevant for three of the things you've been talking about. And it is totally irrelevant for several of the others. What do we do with that?
Could I add to what I say that when a bibliographer uses the term book, they do not necessarily mean the larger meanings that get attached to books. They mean a material object in which there are written things. And this has caused endless problems in some of the things that I have read because it has not been carefully thought through at all. There was an image that we had that I was going to put up, and it was of the wonderful buffalo robe in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Is it still possible to put it up? I don't know. Anyway, it is got writing all over it, but it's not, there are stories all over it, but they are not writing or stories of the sort that we would immediately ask about or understand. Buffalo robes are very uncommon as bearers of as substrates for the kind of writing that we encounter. And in addition, the reading process of the buffalo robe is different from our reading process because when it's being properly used, it requires not only the object itself, but the person whose robe it is to extrapolate and explain it. There is a speech involved.
Jermaine,
Jermaine, we're
gonna-
running short on time. I wonder if we can.
Oh,
move
all
on
right,
swiftly.
fine.
So sorry.
No problem.
In the room, Liliana, and then on the screen. But sorry to interrupt, Jermaine.
No problem.
Liliana,
I wonder whether it would make sense.
could you please speak up a bit?
I wonder whether it would make sense to different questions, not about the book or not the book, but what I was struck is the question of rootedness and stillness and movability. The stone inscriptions don't move except they decode. But then you have all kinds of other movable items. There's the canoe, but they're also the books, because the books are not these large volumes that you deposit in a church and you change a page and you can't carry it out or something. You all insisted on how small they are and that they're even smaller than your hand. So it's not just to see it in relationship to the body, which I think is very important, but also that you carry it and you can move with it. So the question of location and movability seems to run through all of this. And I wonder whether one can make something about this, because, you know, codex is not equal to codex, but there are certainly scrolls or codexes that can be moved and others that can't. And you are here very much with the exception of the stone that is decaying in a very transitionary phase, both in time what happens with it, but also how it can change location.
Mhm.
Does that characterize?
I think a focus on location is so essential for anything having to do with Indigenous history. Because understanding, as Jermaine said a little bit ago, understanding where something is coming from and where it is going to, both in time and in space, is really the real question for when you're trying to pin down an interpretation. Like what John was talking about with how can we call this Chiwenathwa an author? It's like, well, it depends on when we are asking that. Like, would he recognize that term? We don't know, but we might want to do that work as we are trying to push book history forward. Also, I don't think anyone was worried about book. That was one of the interesting things about American Contact, and we finally just started using the term textual object. And we had to change our title to Boundaries of Book History because it was so far beyond.
Yeah.
I still think the question of codex is worth getting into since it is really important, but also there it becomes important because of the applied expertise of the peoples whose hands it passed through in different times and places, whether it be vermilion or quill work. So that's my editor's perspective. I always have too much to say about these essays because I love them all so much.
I think Amy Stillman wanted to get in on that question.
Amy Stillman.
Hi. Several thoughts came up with the question of are there more commonalities than differences or vice versa? I see two commonalities. One is inscription and the other is communication. I also see, with respect to the question of book, acknowledging that the history of a book is a very old and venerable field, that the book is a European invention. So, when looking into Indigenous history anywhere, one has to ask what are the ideas about books and inscription and what they convey to Indigenous people, and not simply impose a concept, which I had to do a quick Wikipedia lookup this morning to find that essentially a book is a collection of pages that are glued or sewn together. Okay, so for example, my sheet music folio had 2 songs in it. It's not simply a single song, which is the convention in sheet music publishing. Does it begin to approach a book? Question mark. Another example, though, is that there were sheet music series, that series of anywhere from 12 to 30 different songs, at least 3 series that I know of, where the individual sheet musics, after they had all appeared in print, the individual sheets were bound up together and sold as a songbook with a songbook title. Okay, so one has to keep in mind the concept of book and what it means to different audiences. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and one of the things that I found so striking in your sheet music was that it was very clearly copyrighted. The copyright was marked on that first page, which is certainly an imposition not only of a Western print convention, but a Western legal convention.
Actually, it was not an imposition in the sense that songwriters were at that even in the 1880s and 1870s, Hawaiian songwriters were aware of US copyright practice and chose to opt into that system.
Yeah. Although the copyright was held by somebody named Reynolds, who was presumably not the composer.
As is the case with with much music, both on the continent in the American popular music industry, where copyright gets held by the producer of the product rather than the author.
Yes, please.
Hello, thank you so much for this. My question is to Amy Stillman. Aloha, Kumu Stillman. I wanted to ask you about your resistance to the language of decoloniality, which you mentioned in your talk later on. And I wondered, as we sort of grow cautious with this, with the language of decolonization and what it can do, I wondered where you think critical Indigenous studies as a field is heading.
The concept of decolonization has been a very popular one in Indigenous communities struggling to regain, recapture, resurrect, revive, revitalize. The baggage that comes with decolonization is that it has an oppositional feel to it, that to decolonize is also to resist what is not indigenous, and the language of resistance has real limitations. I do think that the field is moving towards language of insistence rather than resistance. We don't have to be resisting something in order to simply take ownership of something and claim it as our choice.
Closing thoughts from anybody in the audience? Zach, maybe not a closing thought.
No, just to get back to one of the things you opened with, Glenda, where if I heard you right, you said, you know, a lot of people were interested in seeing what they could get from the language of book history. And I'm interested, you know, all of the texts that were discussed were material texts of various kinds. So I think we can understand how to work with codex, sheet music forms. I'm curious about chapters that maybe were about objects that are less obviously textual from the perspective of the history of material texts. And then, so to reverse the question is like, what can we get from, say, fields of study of material culture that do not come out of the history of material text? We've talked about this before in the seminar with, say, the museum studies, or other form archaeology, other forms of object studies, right? Material cultural studies that are not really even in our very large ambit of the history of material text. I don't wonder if any of you, I mean, most of the texts here were, I think, fairly recognizable under the confines of a seminar like this. Even the writings on stone, you know, have resonances with epigraphy and other things that we've seen. So I'm curious about other aspects of the book, putting together the book that maybe you thought, okay, there's something we can learn from this other area, you know, where it's maybe parts of the quilt that don't have writing on them, you know, that kind of.
Can I just tell you about a few of them? Because I love this question. Anything that helps me remember all of the incredible chapters in this book. Our own Penn's own Bethany Wiggin wrote a chapter about the Christoph Sauer house. So the object in that is a house. Chadwick Allen wrote a chapter about Serpent Mound in Chillicothe, Ohio, reading the mound. And these are drawing on like Indigenous community knowledge to understand how it would have been viewed at what times of day, not taking a panoptic, you know, view, but instead positional in terms of different places you can access it as a human. Emily Moore wrote a chapter about the Lincoln pole, about a totem pole and its removal from its home and its replication. I mean, all of these drawing, which I think she's in literary studies, but still drawing in a way of understanding reading totemic figures that goes beyond textuality and actually draws on community knowledge and local history. So all of those fields, you know, helped make us realize that we were pretty parochial in working with textualities that we kind of take for granted. And we didn't want to stop there. You know, we would have gone further in terms of reading landscapes if we felt we had any, like, should it be us who does that? I'm not really sure. I'm a musicologist, so, you know, I don't read landscapes often.
Well, we thank you for everything you did read. Thank you all for being here. We thank you for your contributions to the book. We thank you all for the book. So